All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining me this evening for the Literature at Our House Open House. The previous times that I've been part of open houses, I've been in the brick and mortar school, and I get to show my classroom off to parents and students, and it's at the school. But since we don't have a separate building, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show off our online classroom. And this particular open house, what I'd like to do is to show off what we've done over the course of the year. Share with you what online literature classes look like, and more specifically, what the approach of the Literature at Our House program is. I think it's a distinctive, innovative approach, and I hope to be able to communicate that with you. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the books that we've read over the course of the year, then take you through a kind of systematic manner in which we go through books in general, and give you plenty of examples from the classroom that help illustrate the approach that we take. All right. Now, during this time, you guys can chat in the chat section. I'll stop periodically to answer questions. I might see some things pop up in the chat and react to them, or I might not. It just depends on how fast it goes. If there is something that you really want to get in, raise your hand. Click on that little hand icon and go ahead and do that. Now, first, a little bit about myself and how the program got started. I have been a literature and art appreciation teacher for 9 years now. And I spent much of that time at a wonderful private school in Southern California called Van Dam Academy. And last year, or I guess this past fall, I've started teaching literature online. And I've joined Scott Powell with his Learning at Our House network. And he was looking for a literature teacher, and I joined him to offer the literature portion of the Learning at Our House network. The literature portion fits in nicely with the History at Our House, especially History at Our House, which is part of Literature at Our House, or which is part of Learning at Our House. And the way that it fits in with the History at Our House, which Scott teaches, is history that the way Scott teaches operates on a 3-year rotation. The first year is ancient history, then you've got European history, then you've got American history, and it repeats. And the literature years correspond to those history years. So this year was European history year, and consequently, we read a lot of literature that was set in Europe during the medieval time period, during the Renaissance, during the revolutions, so forth. And one of the great benefits of doing it that way, well, there are benefits both for history and for literature. The benefits for literature of doing it that way is that those students who are taking the history class with Mr. Powell come in with background knowledge that is helpful for them to grasp a little bit of the time period of the story, the culture in which the story takes place, and some mental images of what that time period would look like so that they can better visualize the events and the characters of the story as they go along. All right. But I want to stress one thing. Literature at Our House, though it works well with History at Our House, the history is not a prerequisite for taking the Literature at Our House program. And I will illustrate to you how I tie in history and give some necessary historical background for each book for the students to get the most out of those stories. So let's begin talking about the books that we read over the course of the year. And I want to start with this slide. Here we go. There's just an array of all the books. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and give you a one-sentence statement of what each of these books is about. Some of them you'll recognize. Some of them might be unfamiliar. The choice of these books is dependent on a couple of things. One, they typically tie in to European history, to the historical portion. They don't all. Some of them don't. Many of them do. Second, they are appropriate for the grade level, not just in the reading level, but also in the content and in the meanings that the students can grasp. So even though we read something like Victor Hugo's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which Victor Hugo wrote for adults, the themes, the ideas can be grasped by students that are 12, 13, and they can find them meaningful. So whatever classics that we read, they are classics that will tie to the students' own values in some way. So those are the two main ways in which we select the books. Let me go through very quickly and share with you these books. So let me pull out my little arrow. Oh, by the way, the format that we have here, this little classroom setup right here, this is how I teach the students. This is how I teach the students. Okay. So right here we have The Miracle Worker. Many of you probably know the movie. The Miracle Worker is about a teacher who tries to teach a deaf, savage, blind student language. But the main obstacle is the parents who pity their child. Then we have Beowulf over here, a retelling of the Beowulf story, novelized version, which is about an atypical hero who is not the perfect knight in shining armor, but whose heroism comes in embracing his own flaws, giving him this kind of self-assured confidence to take on the vilest, most wicked creatures ever imagined. Ties in nicely to European medieval history there. Then we have 12 Angry Men over here. In the junior high, we read plays, and 12 Angry Men is a great play and a great movie. 12 Angry Men is about a juror who votes not guilty during jury deliberations while his 11 other peers vote guilty in a murder trial, which the verdict seems completely obvious. Next, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, one of my favorite novels to teach, and I think the students really, really enjoyed it as well. It's a pretty big novel and seems daunting at first, and those are the types of novels that I like to teach. Those novels that students would not necessarily pick up on their own, but with a little bit of help and some guidance and going through the process that we go through, they end up loving it. So The Hunchback of Notre Dame is about a lustful priest who aggressively pursues an unwilling, beautiful gypsy girl who is defended by that priest's own deformed foster son, who himself is in love with a gypsy girl. Lots of drama and conflict there. Then we have Cyrano de Bergerac, one of the great plays of all time, about an ugly, deformed, but brilliant man who works to win the woman he loves, not for himself, but for his handsome and stupid rival. And then The Scarlet Pimpernel, the book that we are currently reading, we just started, set during the French Revolution, where a dashing and mysterious British aristocrat saves French aristocrats from the monstrous guillotine of the French Revolution. So those are junior high stories. Those are the ones that we've read and we are currently reading. As for the upper elementary, we have here one of my favorite fantasy stories called The Book of Three, about a young pig farmer who resents being a pig farmer and would rather be fighting battles, and then is suddenly swept up in an epic struggle of good and evil where his kingdom is at stake. And then we read stories of King Arthur's knights who are out to prove their worth and to uphold their code of chivalry. And then breaking away from European history, we read Hatchet. It's about a young boy who's going through a divorce. He's filled with self-pity, and then suddenly finds himself in the middle of the Canadian wilderness, alone, lost, right after a plane crash. And then Queen Eleanor. Queen Eleanor was the only nonfiction book that we've read in either of the classes this year, in either the junior high or the upper elementary class. And typically we do not read nonfiction books. But Queen Eleanor was an exception for a couple of reasons. The main one being that the style of the book is kind of in the novelized form. So it tells a story of Eleanor of Aquitaine from basically her birth to her death. And Eleanor of Aquitaine is a character that many of the students had heard about in history, only tangentially, and we'll talk a little bit more about the value of reading this biography, this dramatic biography of Eleanor's life in a little bit. The next book right here is called From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil Frankweiler, about a young girl, sixth grader, who decides to run away from home and with her younger brother, and live in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in search of a deeper meaning to her life than she has so far found in her routine, monotonous living. And then the book that we are currently reading, The Secret Garden. An utterly disagreeable girl comes to live with an even more disagreeable relative in 19th century England, and discovers a mysterious garden that she decides she is going to revitalize. Okay, let's see. I'm going to pause for questions, and I'm going to take a quick look at the chat. So if there are any questions about the books right now, Timothy, you're telling me I'm frozen. That's not good. Let's see. Tonya, you have no sound. Tonya, one solution, if you are having some trouble, what you can do is to log off and log back on. And that will often work. Timothy, am I still frozen? Okay. All right. Looks like we got several more people coming in. All right. Welcome aboard, everybody that's just come on, in the past 10 minutes or so. Okay. Raise your hand if you're okay right now and you can see me and hear me pretty well. Okay. I see a majority of the hands going up. Very good. Tonya, let's see, are you still having the issue? Tonya, if you're still having the issue, try logging off and logging back on. All right. Can you lower hands? Okay, I see some students from class here. Welcome aboard. All right. I've lowered all the hands. Are there any particular questions right now? Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a little bit of the process that we take when we're reading these novels, and talk to you a little bit about the main goal that we have for the literature class. I'm going to wipe off the sweat gathering around my brow, around my cheeks. And during this time, what I'll do is I'll shut off my video during this time while I present this quick slideshow. Maybe that will help some of the fluctuations. I'm still here. Video is off. Okay. Oh, Rebecca. Yeah, thanks for jumping in and answering questions. That's very helpful. Yeah, sixth graders typically, I would say, upper elementary. Now, talking a little bit about the school year. So the first thing I want to emphasize is what the goal is of the class. The goal is to help students fall in love with great literature. Great literature, I mean classics that students might be intimidated by, might not want to pick up. They're not the popular thing. They're not the easiest to read. But they have a lot of meaning, a lot of depth, and they are thrilling and exciting once you get into them. And what do I mean by help students fall in love with it? Well, here's what I mean. Two things. One, to expose them to that literature, to get them to see how wonderful it is, so that if they read The Hunchback of Notre Dame, they're going to think, oh, wow, I can't wait to pick up another Victor Hugo novel. I want to read Les Miserables. And the second thing, to guide them through a process that will help them immerse themselves in the story and see the personal relevance of what is going on. To see these stories as characters that they can identify with, going through, even though they might seem grand and distant, going through conflicts that they can relate to and caring about what happens to them. Becoming more intimately familiar with these great human beings that they're discovering in the literature, more familiar than they could even become with people that they know, either from history or from real life. That's one of the great values of literature. So the process. We do literature, and that means that we do novels and plays, and we also do poetry, art, and music. The centerpiece, though, is a novel or play that we're reading. The poetry, the art, the music are tied into the novels and help us understand the characters and the themes. As we go through and I go explain the process, I'll show you examples of how we tie in poetry and music and art. First, before we begin the novel, we get a little bit of background on it. Setting and history. I'll be using a lot of the same slides that I use in class to give you an illustration of what they look like, and I'll talk about them. Let me get a quick hand can raise to make sure that everybody can see what I'm seeing. Raise your hand if you can see the two slides. One of them is The Hunchback of Notre Dame, class number 1. The other one is Hatchet, class number 1. All right. Okay, I see most hands go up. If you're having trouble seeing anything, you mention it in the chat, and we'll try to troubleshoot that. Okay, good. Now, when we talk about the background, that's primarily when I will bring in the history that Mr. Powell might be teaching. Medieval history over here, and you might be able to read a little bit of 15th century Paris, two great powers, the church, the monarchy, Renaissance, but superstition and mysticism are still pervasive. The key in giving background information is not just to give background information for the sake of giving the students a history lesson. It is purposeful The history information that they're getting is directly relevant to understanding the characters and the events that are going to unfold. I see a hand up. Is that for a question, Tara? Tara, if you have that question, go ahead and put it in your chat. Jeremy, okay, no problem. Jeremy, is that for a question or is that for an observation? Hey, no worries at all. No worries at all. At least you know it works. Okay. Now, another purpose of bringing in some background information is to get some sense of what the setting of these places would look like. So I have an image of Notre Dame, and later on we talk a little bit about Notre Dame. Here, when we're talking about Hatchet and the Canadian wilderness, one thing I brought up, there's not much history there, 1980s, when Mr. Travers was a little boy at the time. But some relevant background information, like this map, which is actually a population density map, to show that in Canada, there are not that many people, and just a few images of Canadian wilderness to get a sense of what it looks like there, so that when students start reading on their own, they are primed for imagining the world that they're reading about. Now, when it's a completely new world, like it was for the Book of 3, we'll still try to get a grasp of it. We did some maps of the land of Prydain, and as we read, we kept adding to those places. Now, not only does that give us a sense of the place, but it also helps us retain basic names of places, so that when we read that Taran is going to Cairdathel, we know what Cairdathel is, we know where it is, and we recognize it immediately. It seems so simplistic, but one of the things that is important when getting into a novel is to just simply know the names of people and places that you're reading about, so that you can identify who they are. And that was a fun way of doing that. Now, along with getting a sense of the time and place of the setting, we also, when it becomes relevant, get a sense of the culture. So when I started Cyrano de Bergerac with the junior high students, I showed them this painting of a bunch of aristocrats bowing down to a monk who is ignoring them, and they seem to not particularly care about him, but to bow down to him in deference because he is actually someone with a lot more power than they have. And the thing that we talked about before getting into Cyrano de Bergerac was what do you need to succeed in 16th century France? And we talked about how you needed connections. This monk was connected to Cardinal Richelieu, the most powerful man in France. If you knew some aristocrats, if you were part of that class, if you had those connections, you would be successful. And though that does not have any direct relevance to the beginning of the play, having that background information sets us up for what later comes as a major conflict in Cyrano de Bergerac. Why is he never successful? And then the students look back at this painting and they see, oh, Cyrano is not willing to bend down for anybody who's got power. Also, it has the tangential elements of providing the images, the kind of pictures that the students can use to imagine what the scenes are like. Now, any questions right at this point about how we go about with the background? But you get a sense of how we use art, we use some history to set us in that time and place. The next major thing that we focus a lot on are the characters. As we get introduced to characters, we want to bring them to life. And we bring them to life in a couple of ways. We bring them to life on just the most basic level of what they look like. One of the things that I, as a kid, and I think even as an adult, have a hard time doing is reading through descriptions. I want to get to the action. I want to get to the dialogue. I want the story to move. But often I do that without having a clear idea of who these characters are. So when we read The Hunchback of Notre Dame, I had the students draw portraits of Quasimodo, but not just any random portraits, portraits as Victor Hugo described Quasimodo. We read carefully and looked at that long list of details that Victor Hugo used to describe Quasimodo and used those to illustrate them. So here's an example of some of the students' portraits of Quasimodo. The center one is a breakfast version of Quasimodo's portrait. But just an exercise like that helps the students gear their mind to looking at descriptions as something that they can visualize. All of this process that we're going through not only gets us into the novels that we're reading, but also provides some skills that the students can then use on their own and that we build up using them in each novel as we go along. Now, what about a play? When there are no character descriptions, where the only thing that we have basically is words and actions. What we learn here is to form conclusions about personalities based on our first impressions, to infer from characters simply by something as simple as juror number 7 offers juror number 8 some gum. And we draw conclusions. Every detail in a work of literature is important, and in 12 Angry Men, just as in all those others, but in 12 Angry Men, the point was really stressed. We can form conclusions about personalities and characters based on our first impressions. So they didn't even have names. They went by jury number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So forming conclusions about what they look like, what characters look like, what characters are like based on their actions and dialogue. And then we get more in depth in the characters. We learn about their motivations and their values, and we connect those motivations and values to our own life. So when we read the Hunchback of Notre Dame, and we were reading about Quasimodo, that terribly ugly bell ringer, we read a description that Victor Hugo had of Quasimodo with his bells. How he would run up the steps of Notre Dame, all 470-something of them, speak to them, shout to them, encourage them, laugh out loud, jump on them and ride them. He had names for all of them. He caressed them. He could hear them though he was deaf. He loved the bells. They were precious to him. And at this point, I asked the students, okay, what is something precious to you? And how do you show that it is precious to you? And so an assignment that I had students do was to write a paragraph, and there I have a couple of examples that you could glance through of something that is precious to the student and a few details of how they show that that object is precious to them. The first paragraph is about a coin collection, and I love the detail about not letting anybody touch those coins because any bit of oils on the fingers will damage them. And the second paragraph is about point shoes. And even though I like the last sentence, even though they're old and dirty and tattered, I always smile when I see them because they were some of the first. They were the first pair of punk shoes. But after the students do this assignment, they feel a bond with Quasimodo. I have something precious to me. I know that feeling. I love it. And I know how Quasimodo feels about his bells. All right. Any questions so far about how we approach characterization? Now, after we have a good sense of the characters and we're going through the story as it picks up in drama, what we do is we're anticipating that drama often. We're asking questions about what's going to happen next. We're identifying the conflicts, both external and internal, that these characters have so that we can look forward to heads clashing, disputes, and fights. We can look forward to the plot elements like that. But we also do something else. But before I get to that, I want to see, there's a question that just popped up. How many sessions do you do on each book? Okay, good question. So it depends on the length of the book. And I would say typical, maybe 12 to 14, which includes art and poetry lessons. But we meet 3 times a week, and so we have a couple of chapters reading 10 to 20 pages between each class. Okay, well, thank you for answering that there. Okay, so what is that other thing that we focus on when we're talking about drama? Well, I'm going to give you a couple of examples and draw some conclusions. Here's the first. In the novel that the upper elementary read, from the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil Frankweiler, while at the museum, the students think they have made a discovery. There is a small statue of an angel that is being paraded around, and there's a lot of hubbub over because it is thought to be by Michelangelo Buonarroti. And Claudia and Jamie decide that they are going to try to discover the identity, the true, whether or not it is by Michelangelo. And so what they proceed to do is do some research. And to kind of get the students excited and into the drama of doing research, art historical research that Claudia and Jamie are doing, I gave them a little bit of an art history lesson. One in which we talked about what Michelangelo artworks look like, and then talked about our own little, I guess, games of figuring out whether or not an artwork is by Michelangelo or not. So these are all by Michelangelo here. Those are some traits we talked about, and then we played a little game. And I asked them, okay, of these 3 sculptures, which one is by Michelangelo and why? And we played this little game, and we did this, and we saw that it was kind of fun and exciting to try to identify the sculptor based on these clues. And that was what Claudia and Jamie were doing. So that portion of their story became more interesting. Now, that's one level. That doesn't go too much in depth, but that's one level of depth. Here's another level of depth, the heightened drama. I'm using several instances of the Hunchback of Notre Dame to kind of have a little bit of continuity, and it's probably a story that many of you are familiar with, so that you're kind of getting a little bit of a sense of how the approach progresses throughout. So I had one lesson on where I talked about my little niece Quinn, my motorcycle, and my books. And that lesson was meant to get the students even more pumped and even more primed for the drama that was going to come in The Hunchback of Notre Dame. So how is that? Well, it was a matter of what we talked about as hierarchy of values. I communicated to the students that if I had to choose between the life of my niece or the existence of my books, there would be no choice. My niece is much more important to me than my books are, even though my books are precious to me. And so there is a clear hierarchy of what matters to me. And then the students did a hierarchy of their own values to see what matters to them. And then we looked at the characters of the Hunchback of Notre Dame and saw their hierarchy of values. And then it started dawning on the students. There were conflicts between values within one character's soul. Quasimodo loves his bells, but then suddenly those bells are replaced by Esmeralda. And then what matters more to Quasimodo? Is it his love for the beautiful gypsy girl or his love for his foster father? And when we get to scenes where there are conflicts, where Quasimodo must choose between Esmeralda and his foster father, we get a great sense of the drama and the meaning of the drama that is going on there. Okay, I'm going to pause there for questions, and I see that Tara asked one. So if you have questions, you can either raise your hand, I can try to put you on audio, or you can write in the chat. So Tara says, probably a question for time when a much more in-depth answer is possible. What are the criteria determining what content comprehension level is appropriate for what age? Do you base this on experience, or is there a good reference to use? A former colleague of mine and I came up with the idea of looking at what are the milestones of a child's life. So at what point do they start getting the responsibility of being able to stay outside after school on their own, or being at home on their own? At what point do they get to have friends sleep over? At what point do they start driving a car? So thinking of these milestones and of what matters in a child's life at that point. Now for the Hunchback of Notre Dame, which is a story about romantic love, that at 12 and 13, they're just kind of getting on the cusp of that, but that's not the main thing to take away from that story. It is one thing, but there are other values, like seeing the fact that there is a hierarchy of values that you can have, that there are things that matter to you, or when you're making choices about what matters to you, the choices you make about what matters to you reflect how much you care about them. Okay, that's a little bit muddled, but I think, yeah, it looks like you're kind of getting a sense of it. In any way, the meaning of the stories are taken so that they are connected to the students' lives in some way. And that's a good bridge for the final point. After we finish reading the novel, after we've prepared ourselves for the climax, we experienced the climax, and I loved reading the climactic portions of stories with the students in class. After we do that, then we recap the experience that we have. Just like you, after you've gone on a vacation to Italy and you've had so many wonderful experiences, and you've come home and you have a slideshow of all those experiences, or you have a journal and you look back at what you've done, we treat it that way. We've had this wonderful experience in this world with these characters, and we look back at it. And then we ask ourselves, what do we take away from that? What is the meaning, and how can we use it in our lives? And there are a couple of ways we do that. Okay, before I change the slide, I just want to give a heads up that it's 9:45. I promised to to go to 9:45, but obviously I'm going to go a little bit over. If you can stick around, that's great. I'm going to spend 3 more minutes on this, and then 4 more minutes on what next year will look like, and that will be it. Okay, so deeper meaning and what we take away. After we finish reading the story of Queen Eleanor, we did this poem, and I'll read it to you. The Minuet. Grandma told me all about it, told me so I couldn't doubt it, how she danced. My grandma danced long ago. How she held her pretty head, how her dainty skirt she spread, turning out her pretty toes, how she slowly leaned and rose, long ago. Grandma's hair was bright and sunny, dimpled cheeks too. Ha! How funny! Really, quite a pretty girl, long ago. Bless her, why she wears a cap, Grandma does, and takes a nap every single day. And yet, Grandma danced the minuet long ago. So we took this poem and we looked at it and we asked ourselves, how does this relate to what we've just experienced with the story of Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine? And then I talked to them about my grandmother. And I have a couple of photos down here where you see a family photo that I shared with the students, where there's my grandmother, as I knew her much of my life as an elderly woman. And when she'd passed away, we went through some old photo albums, and I found this photo of my grandmother as a beautiful teenager at a dance. And what we saw was that people who live lives have so much in their life that they've lived. And we went back over with Queen Eleanor and we retraced everything that she had done in her lives, from going off on the Crusades to marrying 2 kings, to raising lots of children, to crossing the Alps when she was almost 80. And we saw how much she had accomplished, and we'd never really imagined that she would have done that, especially if we kind of knew her from history before. But now that we had had a view of her entire life, and we could see that an entire life is something that everybody has, including somebody you may not suspect has that, your grandparents. You can look at what is possible in your own life. You can look forward at what is possible in your 70, 80, 90, and hopefully 150 years. And I had the students ask a relative of theirs to share things with them that they had no idea about, to reinforce that point that their life is long. And here are some of the things that the students came up with. And I'll just give you a moment to glance at those. Even simple little things, like once in college in our organic chemistry class, my mom didn't mix the chemicals right, and the teacher said, "Don't blow it up," and drum roll, please, it blew up. But Tara, to further answer your question, that's the kind of way in which you are tying the meaning of the story to the children's lives and giving them some kind of insight about their own lives. Okay. The last image I have for the process is just another example of this from Cyrano de Bergerac. And after reading Cyrano de Bergerac and reading this tragic story, what are we supposed to get from it? And I share with them this painting of this lord who is in charge of this tulip manor, who's having his tulips destroyed by an official decree from the government there, and he is powerless except that he will protect one precious tulip of his, Semper Augustus. Just as Cyrano fights against the world and protects his precious independence, his precious panache. And we end by asking the students, what is it that you would protect? What matters to you? Just like this Duke of the Tulips, or just like Cyrano fights for. And here's one more little slide. These are some of my favorite photos. These are from Halloween of the students in costume. Okay, in costume. We decided, hey, let's come in costume. Let's show off our costumes, and that was fun. So you get a glimpse there. All right, I'm never really accurate about the time I say. Any quick questions right now about the whole process that we go through? Give you a sense of it, to give you a sense of how to get the students to fall in love with the stories. Give them the appropriate background, the caring for the characters, the understanding of the characters, to prime them to want to read on, getting those maybe difficult portions of the drama that might not be apparent, finding a deeper meaning in those so that the students know what is at stake for these characters and fall in love more with the conflicts that they're going through. And then what is the takeaway? So Rebecca's asking, how much writing do I expect from the upper elementary kids? So probably a paragraph a week, something like that, to that extent. Yeah, paragraph a week. Yeah, I'll definitely explain that. Yeah. So hold on to that question, Rebecca. I'll come to the end for that because I think I want to finish talking about next year for those of you who are just interested in literature and education in general. And then after I finish that discussion, I'll get into specifics about registration and what next year will look like and so forth. But let me talk about now what's in store for next year in terms of the reading materials and so forth. So next year is American History Year with Mr. Powell. And Mr. Powell is an amazing history teacher with a really innovative history program. I've taken his history courses before for adults, and I feel like I learn history in those. So I highly recommend those. Check it out. Just Google History at Our House, and you'll come upon it. I can't say enough about it. It's the best history program by far that I know of in the world. There. But we're going to be reading literature that ties into the history. And so here you can see some examples of the literature there. And the book lists that I have, both those that are tied to American history right here and those that are not, are preliminary book lists. We may read most of those. We may read all of those, but I've selected books dependent on the students I have, the general level of the students, what seems to be working. If I've got a particularly active group, then I might challenge them with something. I tailor the curriculum to my classes. But this gives you a general idea of what I am drawing from. And then let me show you, you can see some poetry there. Let me show you the junior high one before I get into details about those other things down below. So here are the junior high books that we would read in next year. To Kill a Mockingbird, that's a definite. That might be the first book that we read of the year. I love teaching that book. But it's one of those books that is a little bit challenging to get into because of the language, because of the unclear storyline, and with a little bit of guidance, it becomes very personally meaningful. The goal would be to get to Gone with the Wind, 1,200-page tome, that is intimidating. But once you start reading it, once you start getting into it, it's like candy. I think I remember a friend of mine describing that. It's like candy. It's so delicious to read. And it's one that we might get to. And so you can get a sense of the books right here that we would have planned, and some of the other plays that aren't particularly tied to American history, and some of the poetry. All right. Now the schedule, and I'll go back and show you the schedule for, I guess, let me pause at this point. Any final questions on the approach I take in teaching the students, on the particular works I choose, on the pedagogy? All right. Okay. Now I'm going to start talking a little bit about class schedule and writing workshop and class logistics and so forth. So if that's not something that interests you at this point, thank you very much for attending. I hope you got a sense of what you can do maybe with your own children with literature, or what's possible for even yourself with literature. So thank you very much for attending. Now, those of you who are interested in class structure and so forth. So I'll start with junior high, and then I'll go back and talk about upper elementary. The schedule is Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 1 p.m. to 1:45 Eastern Time for each day. Or on the West Coast, that's 10 a.m. to 10:45. Those are for the live classes. But Rebecca, you're bringing up the different tiers. And there are 3 tiers. There are the live classes that your student can attend. There are also just the recordings. If the live classes don't fit in their schedule, and if they do fit, I highly recommend the live classes. There is a lot. I have a lot of discussion in the class, and that's especially valuable for having. But if they don't fit, I have numerous students who listen to the recordings and get a lot out of those. So that's one tier. And then there's a second tier in between those two, which is attending live classes once a week. And you can find all of that information. I'll just direct you to that site right there, right here at the LitAOH, and I've got a special page here for early registration, which is what you would have, that you can sign up for right now. Now, I am considering a writing workshop. One of the things that I've discovered over the course of the year, I've learned a lot about online teaching, and one of the things that I've discovered is that there isn't as much writing or time to talk about writing as I'd like in the classes and the 45 minutes that we have. So both for the upper elementary and the junior high, I want to offer a 1 hour a week writing workshop, where we primarily take the writing assignments that we have from the literature class and expand upon them and focus on style, improving the writing, and then also adding in some more formal writing that is based on the literature that we're reading. So more in-depth analysis of the literature that we're reading. Class size. For both the upper elementary and the junior high, I'm going, and this is something I've learned over the course of the year, I'm going to keep the size to a maximum of 15 students. 15 students, I think, will be just the limit for being able to have enough opportunity for everybody to interact and to chat and to contribute to classroom discussion. More than that, and it would be too many. 15 is already a lot, but I think we could manage with 15. And if there is sufficient interest, if there is a waiting list that starts up, then I will be considering opening up a second class and splitting the junior high group into 2 groups, and so forth. That's a possibility. So what that means is, right now the returning students have had their opportunity to register, and the registration right now is on a first come first served basis. If you are totally convinced at this immediate moment that you want to register your child, you can do so by going to this link. If you're not sure yet, if you want more interaction, and especially this is one thing that I want to offer, an opportunity to have your child or you visit the classroom. Come one day this year and just sit in on the classroom to see what it's like. Just email me right down here. Email me and I'll be glad to set up a visit to the classroom to see what it's like. Okay, let me see there. Quick question or two here. All right. Okay. All right. Thank you. Thanks for answering that. That's basically the answer I would have for books that you've already read. Yeah. Some of the books students have already read, and I encourage students to reread. I tell the students it's like history class. Once you learn about the American Revolution in 4th grade, you want to relearn it in 8th grade to learn much more about it, more in depth. Just like every time I read a novel, and I've read these novels sometimes a dozen times, I get more out of it at each point. And that's more so the case when you're younger and you're maturing faster. Okay. So any questions so far? I'm going to go back and I'm going to show you the upper elementary class schedule, which is a little bit different. You can take a look at that right here. Right now, the upper elementary class schedule is Monday and Wednesday from 2 to 2:35, 35-minute class. And on Friday, it's at a different time, 11 to 11:35. Same thing, I'm interested in offering a writing workshop and the same qualifications for class size. Also, if you are interested in having your child visit, I think if there is some interest but you're not sure of what the online experience would be like in this class, that's what I'd recommend. Just email me, title it class visit class, something like that, and I'd be very happy to set that up with you. Okay, any final questions? All right. If you do have any further questions, feel free to email me, and I'd be happy to answer them. Let's see. Declan, yeah. Let me unmute you. See if I can unmute you. It's working. Oh, hold on one moment. Though the writing workshop is something separate. I want to make that clear. It's something I am considering, but it would be a separate fee. It'd definitely be a separate fee. It would not be included as part of just the literature at our house classes. Because those who are just taking the literature at our house classes may not want to take the writing workshop. So those are 2 separate things. Okay, Declan, I can't seem to unmute you. If you had a question, go ahead and type it in the chat. All right. Well, let me say my thank yous right now. I want to thank Steve Stoddard, and I want to thank Rachel Miner and the parents for helping make this first year a success. I came into this first year wondering if I would have the same kinds of experiences in an online setting that I did in a brick and mortar classroom, and the answer was a resounding yes. I'm excited about improving for next year, and I'm excited for the books and the students coming back and the new students. And thank you for attending. And if there's nothing else, then I look forward to talking with you offline, by email, and have a good night. Bye-bye.